Here we go. So let me just, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you to our host for inviting us. It's really an honor for us to be here. What is critical race theory is the hot topic of the day, right? Let me start us off with kind of a roadmap of what we're going to do today. Um, First, there's kind of an introduction to get us in the right frame of mind that this is a collective inquiry. We're going to talk a little bit about why race is so hard to talk about, right? And try to focus in on that. We'll get right to critical race theory. I'm going to give you some historical background. Critical race theory is about providing a different perspective, and we'll talk more about that. The next thing we're going to do is what are the consequences of this different perspective when we're in a democracy where the majority rules, right? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the current environment, things that are going on that you may have seen in the news, laws that are being proposed and adopted. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a few comments on where do we go from here, which is you might recognize the title of a famous speech and a book by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that's a good way for us to wrap up. Before we dive into the content, there's just a few preliminary matters I wanted to cover. First, something that often goes unacknowledged in discussions about race, this discussion means different things to different people, right? There are different audiences, even in this virtual room. In particular, right, there are a lot of Black people have paid closer attention to racial aspects of our history, which is, natural since they've been on the receiving end of many of those race-conscious policies and practices. So as a consequence, right, it's really hard to give a presentation about race that's equally informative or impactful. And if the audience is mostly white, it's pretty ordinary for the talk to be calibrated primarily for them, right? And that's not new for either Black people or white people or any other people, but Black people have probably noticed it more often, right? And I thought I would at least recognize it out loud so that we all notice. Secondly, I know this is not a secret. I'm Asian, I'm not Black, I'm not white. That's actually useful in teaching about race, and I just want to acknowledge that openly as well, because Black people talking about race, right, they face certain challenges. They have to worry about whether they're being seen as complaining or being angry. White people also face challenges, right? Talking about race, they have to worry about being too defensive or being seen to be unaware or racist. So just recognizing that. And then finally, we are mostly going to be talking about Black and white. And that's intentional. It's not, of course, that there aren't other races. And it's not that there aren't important differences in the Asian experience and the Latino experience compared to African Americans. And believe me, I could talk your ear off about the Asian American experience at the appropriate time. But the clashing narrative about Black and white is the conflict that brings us here today, right? It's the conflict that's an indelible part of American consciousness. And other racial conflicts are formed with the Black-white racial sort of narrative as a backdrop, right? So today we're going to talk primarily about that. So why is race so hard to talk about? I'm going to explain why we have to get beyond the dichotomy of merit versus malice. So here we go. And I know some of you who have seen us present before will have seen a version of this, but I know that we have a lot of new people as well. So look at this chart. The key unavoidable fact that underlies the state of race relations in America today is the persistence of racial inequality between Blacks and whites. So this is a chart showing racial inequality. But you see, there's no other caption here. This could be about infant survival rates. It could be about household wealth. It could be about job offers received with identical resumes, depending on whether the name at the top is Jamal or Bradley. Maybe it's home ownership, college degrees, life expectancy. I think you get the point. There's no numbers on here. And in some ways, the details don't matter, right? We all know as a background fact that racial inequality not only exists, but that it has persisted over time. And the reason that's really important to start off with is, um, that might already be making some people feel uncomfortable. And the reason is that human beings seek meaning, right? We need a story, we need a narrative that makes sense of all of that inequality. And you're probably already hearing in your mind some of the narratives that we use to understand that. The problem is that there's only two main stories we've been using, and they're both really old and really tired, right? So the first narrative says that the cause of inequality is malice or racism. And the paradigmatic symbol of that racism is Bull Connor attacking peaceful demonstrators with fire hoses and dogs. And the problem with this narrative is that many white people don't see themselves as Bull Connor. They feel like this kind of racism is long since past. And for the most part, right, although obviously not entirely, they're right. And there's a softer version of this that concedes that most people these days are not intentional, conscious, malicious racists. So maybe we're going to talk about unconscious racism or institutional racism or structural racism. But the underlying structure of that narrative remains that we're looking for the bad guy, right? We're looking for the racist. The other narrative we use to explain persistent inequality is merit. And this narrative says that fair competition on an unbiased playing field results in racial inequality. And the paradigmatic symbol of that is a race where everyone starts at the same starting line. And the problem with this is that there are plenty of smart, talented Black people working hard, not seeing the rewards, right? They don't see themselves as lacking merit, and they're right too. Now, there's also a softer version of this narrative, right, that says, well, there is a merit deficiency, but maybe it's due to poverty, or it's due to unequal educational opportunities, or maybe it's due to culture or traditions, not inherent or genetic. It's due to the environment, right? But I just want to point out the underlying structure of this narrative also remains that we're locating the problem in the party with the inferior merit, right? We're looking for the source of the deficiency. So we have these narratives. Are we looking for the bad guy, or are we looking for the source of the deficiency? Right? And I'm not, well, I am going to talk about which narrative is accurate, but right now, I'm not talking right now about which narrative is more accurate. What I want to point out is that each of these narratives serves as both an accusation and a self-serving rationalization. Right? I don't mean the content of them. I mean how they feel when they're presented. Right? When persistent racial inequality is the topic, white people feel accused of being racist. Black people feel accused of being inferior. And I think that these narratives, they're so ubiquitous, they're so familiar, they're present even if no one names them. Right? The fact of racial inequality makes everyone feel accused, makes everyone feel defensive. And we each have a self-serving justification to turn to, right? Self-serving rationalization, just for a moment, an aside, we all do this, right? When good things happen, we take credit for our hard work and talent. We feel like we must have done something right. When bad things happen, we attribute it to bad luck or unfairness, right? And it's really powerful. The example I often give is that I personally, I exercise hardly at all, and I eat pretty much anything I want. And I cannot even tell you how morally superior I feel, right, when I'm standing next to someone who struggles with their weight. And I just told you that I know intellectually that there's no merit involved with the fact that I have a slender build, right? But I'm just telling you how it feels, right? Because of this cultural narrative, I stand there, I feel like, well, here I am, all nimble and spry, right? I'm going to take credit for that. So the reason I say that is there's no mystery why the narrative of meritocracy is attractive if you're white, and the narrative of racism or malice is attractive if you're Black, right? That's why it's so hard to talk about race, right? We are pulled by self-serving rationalization to a particular narrative that makes it really hard for us to listen, right, to arguments objectively. Right? Now, there's one more thing I'm going to say about this. I presented these stories as though they were sort of emotionally equivalent, right? Everyone's feelings are valid. stay with me just for a moment. How do we make decisions between stories in a democracy? The answer is that we vote, right? One of the reasons the merit story is more widespread is that the merit story is more appealing to white people, and there are more white people than Black people. So when we all vote, if the merit story is on the ballot, right, the merit story wins.
There you go. So we're going to do a quick exercise in what is merit. Let me share my screen so you can, this will stop the other person. Yes, I want to continue. This is the next Menti code question, and it should work just the same as the other question did. And our question, which some of you may recognize as a question about merit, Microsoft Windows is a better product than Apple operating system. Agree or disagree and explain in one line, 15-word max. So go ahead and do that, and you're and anybody who is seeking credit for attendance, please also put your name in the Zoom chat. That's our way of knowing that you're here and participating. And I am going to figure out how to also give you a running picture of what's going on. It's just going to take me 1 second to move that to the right screen. There we go. So you can see this should start scrolling. Please press enter. No, I don't want to pause scroll. So so you can see people have different ideas about which of these is meritorious. I don't know anything about Apple, so I'm going to agree that Microsoft is better. Both are good, but for different purposes. So that's somebody who, you know, is kind of willing to balance that out. Agree because Microsoft is what I'm most familiar with. I'm going to say most because what I'm most familiar with at work. I have no idea. I have only used iOS for casual work. Agree, it's more widely used. So you can see how these answers, Windows is ubiquitous, right? That's the very same word that Brant used about the merit narrative. I think he used it about the narrative. I could be wrong. I heard the word. It depends on which you're used to using. Apple's easier and safer. So you can see that people have pretty clear ideas about this one way or the other based on what they bring to the conversation. And that's a narrative. This is the Apple versus Microsoft narrative. And it's kind of a way to look at this question without it being a scary question about race, frankly. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and sure, you go right ahead. Let me know when you want me to take it down.
Actually, I just asked Marie to keep that up, and I'm just going to comment on this for a minute. So as background for this question,
sorry.
It's interesting for you to know that Microsoft Windows still controls 85% of the world's laptops and desktop computers. I wonder if that changes how you see this question, right? Because two of the answers I saw up there was really interesting. One of them said, yeah, Microsoft is better because more people use it. And my question about that is that really merit, right? Are we saying more people use it, that shows that it's better, right? Or is it, I mean, usually when we talk about merit, we're talking about something intrinsically with the product that makes it a better product, better at doing what it's supposed to do. And then another answer said, yes, but only because more people use it, right? Which is kind of the same point, but really the opposite, right? It's not a better product intrinsically, but it is better just because everybody else is using it, right? Now, I mean, I'll just toss out the analogy, right? If white people are Windows, right, one of the advantages is not about intrinsic merit. It's about the fact that more people have that identity, right? So let's move on from that, and now let me share to my PowerPoint. So now we know why race puts us on edge, and maybe that can help us see more clearly the next topic, which is critical race theory itself. And I will tell you that part of this talk is primarily about different experiences, right? Different perspectives, different narratives of America. So let's get into it. What is all the hoopla about? Last fall, in the middle of a hotly contested, the fall of 2020, middle of a hotly contested election, President Trump issued an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. And the claim was that there's a new ideology that teaches that all white people are inherently racist oppressors, that America is fundamentally and irredeemably racist, that we should reject color blindness and acknowledge that meritocracy and hard work and even objectivity itself are tools of oppression. And although it was not mentioned in the executive order itself, that new ideology was called critical race theory. And suddenly there were videos and experts popping up all over my social media feed explaining how critical race theory was based on Marxism, right? And how it was a scheme to indoctrinate children to think of white people as oppressors. So the uproar grew. Several states enacted legislation prohibiting critical race theory, or purporting to prohibit critical race theory, right? There were school board meetings with angry parents claiming that their children were being taught not to be colorblind or taught to think that their parents are racist, including locally here in Ohio, right? That many of you may have noticed. There are bills currently that have been proposed in Ohio that are currently moving through the legislative process, and the expectation has been that in one form or another they will become law, right? And they prohibit many of the same exact things that the executive order talked about, right? So, so Maria, I think we wanted to share the reactions.
So some of you took the pre-survey, the pre-event survey and answered the questions. There were 69 this morning, but I pulled this data when there were 66, and Sherry said there were 100 and some people attending. So some of you, so that the room is not exactly represented by this, because I think maybe only half the people participated. But you can see that there's a segment, the blue and the red, of people that only became aware of critical race theory in the last 6 months, or were not aware of it at all until coming today. And that's about, that's like 10 or 11, 12% of the people who responded. And of the other two groups, there's a larger group that has been aware of it for longer than a year, but not that much larger than the people who've been aware of it in the last year. So like since the rhetoric around the election and what's come after that. So there is a wide range there is a wide range of exposure here. And okay. And so just to be aware of, as we're talking about this relatively complex area of legal scholarship, there's a wide range of people who've even heard anything about it. I'm going to turn it back over to Brant.
After 2 years, I am finally learning to unmute before I talk. So what is critical race theory? Technically, critical race theory is a name that was given to the work of a group of legal scholars. They were writing starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It wasn't actually called critical race theory until there was this academic workshop in 1989 that was called the Critical Race Theory Workshop. And what I just want to explain an academic workshop, what that means is that a bunch of law professors, and I think there were maybe 20 or 30 at the maximum, get together on a weekend at a crappy hotel, right, and exchange draft law review articles, right? It's the most nerdy thing you ever saw, right? And so narrowly defined, right, critical race theory is a pretty high level theory that not even most law students are taught, right? Occasionally I teach a critical race theory seminar that most law students don't take, right? And there's no authoritative definition, right? There is no critical race theory association that votes to adopt, these are the principal tenets of critical race theory. And the nature of academics is that we pick nits, right? That is our whole profession, is to argue over tiny differences of opinion about irrelevant things. So we disagree. So it's, you know, one of the most things that's been most uh, amusing um, to me about some of what's being said about critical race theory is um, uh, I don't uh, you know, I've been thinking and teaching what I thought was critical race theory for a long time. I was a law school, my law school mentor was Derek Bell, who's credited as being one of the founders. So I think of myself as a race crit, right? Full disclosure. And I don't believe any of those things that people are saying that critical race theory says. I'm not a Marxist, for example. Um, I can tell you that many of the things that have been attributed to it are simply incorrect, right? I don't teach that all white people are racist or that meritocracy and objectivity are merely tools of white supremacy. Right? So what were these law professors talking about, if not that, right? I'm not gonna dwell on, you know, whether things have been mischaracterized technically and historically. So academic movement, no real definition, but there are some common themes, right? There's a reason why you call it a movement that ties it together. So what were these law professors writing about? In my view, the way to summarize what critical race theorists were doing is they were telling a story from a different perspective. And especially at the outset, there was a lot of emphasis on narrative and context, right? And I think for a lay audience, the idea here is, you know, you use narrative to capture a situation when the existing theory doesn't provide the concept that you need. So you may not be able to articulate exactly what the concepts are before you do the analysis, but you can at least tell a story that says, this is why this doesn't feel fair, because this is what happened, right? And I don't know how that fits into, you know, current Title VII jurisprudence or whatever, right, the legal arguments are, but something here is not working, right? So it starts with telling a story. And these legal scholars, many of them minorities, many of them African-American, but there were also Asian Americans, there were also white people, right? Were looking at that situation. And they could see what we just talked about, that there's persistent racial inequality. And their experience told them that it was not the result of unequal merit and also not the result of old-fashioned racist malice, right? Discriminatory acts by individuals, right? And so in various ways, these scholars, from all kinds of different perspectives, they started to try to understand this. They looked at the historical foundations of our institutions and our rules. They looked at how different processes that don't on their face say anything about race might have a differential impact nonetheless. They looked at social psychology to figure out how people who are not consciously malicious might still end up acting in certain ways that were detrimental to people who are racial minorities. So in general, they ended up describing all sorts of different ways that racially unequal results could be produced and maintained without any racist intent, right? There was actually a book called Racism Without Racists, right? And the problem is that in the broad public understanding and also in the courts, the harm was defined as intentional discrimination. That's why the laws that we passed were anti-discrimination laws, right? They weren't anti-inequality laws. And those laws didn't address any of these issues that these scholars were starting to identify, right? You know, the point here is that not all harm is the result of discrimination, right? Many of you may know or have heard about the history of racial exclusion and redlining that caused African Americans at a very important time in history when people started that nest egg, right, to build their wealth, were excluded from the process of being able to buy homes in good neighborhoods, right? You know, I was just reading about a Black community in Ohio near Cincinnati. I'm pretty sure this is in Ohio, that wanted to, they were a relatively like middle class Black neighborhood outside of the city and they wanted to incorporate. And the county said no. And at the time that they wanted to do it, there was a factory nearby. If that had been included in their township, that would have been an important tax base, right? There were other areas nearby that other local communities started to annex because it wasn't incorporated, and that became no longer available to this Black community. And then years later, when this Black community was finally given the authority to form a town, they had only a small area left with no tax base, right? And that town exists today and is a dying community, right? And so they can't point to any current racist who is causing their problem. And I think that a lot of people, because this merit narrative is so powerful, right? You look at a fallen community and you presume they must not be doing something wrong. They must not be good managers of property, right? And then, if you presume that the cause of inequality is a lack of merit, then to the extent that anybody wants to provide a solution, it's all about improving merit, right? Rather than changing the systems or the conditions or the rules, right, that really are the source of that inequality, right? So focusing on discrimination, right, misses the harms that were the result of putting in place rules that made the playing field favor some over others historically, right? And that presumption of merit is not always warranted. So generally speaking, we're talking about this alternative perspective on institutions, on history, and on law, right? And how they're working. I'm gonna, since critical race theory is essentially about telling a different story, we're gonna talk about different narratives of America, right? Now, every nation needs a story, right? A coherent moral arc that we embrace as fellow citizens. And our traditional story has been under a lot of strain lately. So I'm going to start with the mainstream historical narrative, the way you learn about it in school, right? The story that's the default story that your imagination turns to when you're trying to fill a gap, right? In thinking about how to understand the importance of a flag or a monument, right? And the traditional story is a story of progress, right? So if you think about the founding fathers, right, the story we're presented is that they brilliantly created a new thing, right? A form of self-governance never before seen on the planet, no more kings, democracy. And we all understand they had their blind spots. They were creatures of their times. They left out women, they left out Black people, indigenous people, right? Even the traditional mainstream narrative acknowledges, right, that there were holes in the system, but the principles they established, lasting and eternal, especially after we passed the Bill of Rights, right, just a little while later. And then, right, in the 19th century, America carried out its manifest destiny to extend its reach across the continent, capturing new territory by purchase or conquest until we stretched from sea to shining sea. And we still weren't perfect, right? We acknowledged that we treated Native Americans poorly. Conquest, it's not exactly a moral principle. And we had a cataclysmic civil war and we abolished slavery, right? This is a huge step towards making the ideal of equality real. And after the Civil War, what I remember from school is that during Reconstruction, right, that period right after the Civil War ended, the Northerners were corrupt drunkards and scalawags, and the Black people didn't know how to govern. And eventually their inept regime fell apart and the North withdrew. And there might have been a paragraph about sharecropping as an economic arrangement. So that's the, right, this is this mainstream story. And then in that story, right, in the 20th century, we had industrialization, we had the arrival of waves of immigrants yearning to breathe free, the great migration of Black people northward to industrial cities for jobs, a depression, and then the New Deal to give everyone a head start on colleges and job and home ownership, and world wars. And through technological and military progress, right, the 20th century is when America becomes a great nation. It's the beacon to freedom-seeking people everywhere. right? There was a book written that said, called The End of History, that said we had discovered the final form of government that was going to be good for everyone, right? A liberal democracy with a free market, right? And not only that, right? In the 20th century, we finally confronted race. We got Brown versus Board of Education. We got the Civil Rights Movement, where we eliminated segregation. We outlawed discrimination. And together with Dr. King, we all dreamed about our children playing together and being judged by the content of their character. A few warts, a few hurdles we were slow to overcome, a general story of forward progress. This is, of course, a very rough outline, very sketchy, but I think it captures kind of the main plot points in the narrative. All right, so now let me go back and sketch out a different narrative. And I want you to try to react, not sort of with regard to whether it's a good narrative or a patriotic narrative, but whether you can understand how someone might see things this way, right? Because this is also a coherent story. It's a story of bravery and persistence and perseverance, right? So let's start over with the Founding Fathers. The Constitution famously included the 3/5 clause. I want to really clarify this. Sometimes people think that this means that the Constitution only recognized Black people as 3/5 of a person. That's not accurate, actually, but what it did mean is worse, because what the 3/5 clause did, what it gave enslavers more power, right? Here's the actual language, right? Representatives shall be apportioned according to their respective numbers, right? This is the clause that says when we apportion how many members of Congress your state gets according to the population of the state, right? We're going to count the people in your state, right? Including 3/5 of all other persons, right? So let me just pause there. This is still how we apportion representatives, right? Wyoming has 1 member of Congress and California has 53, right? We apportion according to population, and California is so much bigger. And so when they were apportioning Congress, members of Congress, right at the outset, right? Slaves, it's the slave-holding states that wanted to count Black people more, right? I mean, it goes without saying in this provision that the slaves could not vote, right? And women couldn't vote. Lots of people couldn't vote, right? So that means that the number of members of Congress that Virginia was going to get, they were going to be chosen by the white male voters. And in 1790, Virginia had about 750,000 people, but only 450,000 of them were white. And they wanted to count everybody, right? They wanted to get congressional representation for their 300,000 non-voting, right, enslaved Black people, whose interests, of course, they were not actually going to represent. And the northern states didn't think they should get any. Why should you get extra members of Congress for people that you treat like property, right? And the compromise was 3/5, right? So that meant that the white voters in Virginia in 1790 got to have 19 members of Congress. And if they had not been able to count 3/5 of their enslaved people, they would have had only 14. And throughout the South, it's the same story, right? Slaves were about 1/3 of the population during this period. And that means that Southern political power was boosted by 20% all the way until the Civil War. Right? And that, of course, extends to the Electoral College, right? Each state gets the number of votes in the Electoral College equal to the number of senators plus the number of representatives. So just as Southern representatives in Congress was inflated, their power in the Electoral College was also inflated, right? So the power of slavery politically, right, is all the way through from the founding, all the way through until the Civil War, right? So when you think about America as a democracy, right, during this period, this is the foundation of it. And just as a preview, this gets worse after Reconstruction. Second, right, if you're Black, chattel slavery is not a minor point. It's not an error in judgment that white people fixed, right? That many of the founders enslaved Black people, not like having bad habits, right? It's true they were creatures of the time. But for Black people, that's a pretty bad time, right? So maybe not that impressed with the Constitution, right? Somehow slavery, this key engine of the American economy, and we are learning more and more about just how central to America's development slavery was, right? Somehow that is very little emphasized in our history, right? It was not going to quietly die out as some antiquated practice, right? Because of whipping and punishment, slavery was actually a really efficient form of production. Right? The value of enslaved people was a huge portion of the nation's assets, equivalent to the value of all real estate in the country. Right? It was one of the big reasons why we expanded all across the country, but we don't really learn that much about it. So then the Civil War comes, and enslaved people were in fact freed, and that's not easy and should absolutely be celebrated. But I don't know what you remember learning about the end of Reconstruction. I talked about what I learned. Black people in the South immediately after the Civil War, at least in some ways, they flourished, right? They started businesses, they acquired property, they acquired capital, they voted, they ran for office, they were elected. They formed political coalitions with poor white people. They elected senators from the South during Reconstruction, right? So the story of how a political deal was made in exchange for the White House, right? And the federal government withdrew from the South and left Black people at the mercy of cruel and unfair laws, right? Really violent, lawless mobs. And these were Black people who had just had a glimpse of equality, right? A picture of what liberty could look like, right? To be effectively cast back into change, right? Back into chains, that should make you weep. And we adopted vagrancy laws that allowed white sheriffs to arrest Black people on a whim if they didn't have a written employment contract, and then charge fees and fines that extended the sentence to a year, and then leasing the convict out for labor, sometimes reportedly, back to the very plantations where they had been enslaved. And then, right, in the first half of the 20th century, the century when America emerged into greatness, we solidified Jim Crow. There were over 4,000 lynchings throughout the South, most of them with the complicity of or active participation of law enforcement. And the migration that I thought was all about jobs, it was also about escaping terror. Right? So, you know, when you read about countries where gangs openly rove the streets and kill people with impunity, we had that. We had that here if you were Black. And during that whole time, Black people were still persevering, still building themselves up, right? Still moving towards opportunity. But everywhere they succeeded a little bit too much, there was a Tulsa race massacre, there was a Wilmington, there was thriving Black businesses, right? And families and homes built up painstakingly over the course of years, burned to the ground, or people chased out of their homes, or a family member taken and locked up for good. And then when the whole country was suffering through the effects of the Great Depression, right? And FDR rolled out the New Deal. The New Deal came when white Southern Democrats, through intimidation and violence, had complete control over all the legislative power in the South. So now they got to count Black people who, again, still weren't voting, but this time not because of the law, but despite it, right? Southern Democrats now got to count 100% of the Black people in their states who they were intimidating from voting, right? They finally won the 3/5 compromise. They got 100%. And they were a solid voting bloc in the South, and they were a solid voting bloc in Congress and in the Electoral College, and they made sure that the benefits of the New Deal wouldn't upset the social hierarchy in the South. So that meant that perks like the GI Bill were administered locally so that Black people could be steered towards vocational schools rather than college, right? And farm loans and small business loans could be denied year after year in the state office of the federal, right, government, right? And Social Security and fair wage and labor laws, right, originally written to exclude agricultural and domestic labor, which was 60% of how Black people made their living, right? And the federal government subsidized and supported homeownership, but explicitly encouraged banks and developers not to lend in Black neighborhoods, right? Not to sell to Black people, to impose racial restrictions when building new developments. But they openly and honestly thought that racial integration was not a good thing. This is not a secret. So all those returning GIs in the 50s who bought modest homes in nice neighborhoods, and those homes appreciated several times over the decades, right? Helping to fund college education and other needs. Black people were excluded from all of that. at the ground floor. Now, sometimes people will say it's been a long time since slavery, and it's true, it has. And we should learn about what happened every year since slavery. But as you can see, it's not all been roses since then either, right? We're now in the so-called post-civil rights era, but we're still dogged by the past. And let me just give you one example. There's a massive class action against the Department of Agriculture for discriminatorily rejecting loan applications from Black farmers, right? Those are loans that could have kept them afloat, allowed them to invest and grow, while other people, in fact, were able to do that. That class action settled for over $1 billion, right? And that settlement took place during the Obama administration, right? This is not ancient history, right? So we have these two narratives, the story of progress, the story of perseverance, right? Like the first narrative, this narrative is also a gross oversimplification. But which narrative more accurately tells the story of America? Is it the America of principled ideals, imperfect, but slowly becoming more perfect over time? Or is it the America of heart-wrenching heroic perseverance against one unimaginable hurdle after another? Now, there's of course elements of truth in both stories. And judging which of those captures the story of America better, it's subjective. Maybe you identify more with one story than the other. I just want to point out that identification, that's part of the point here, right? Is it harder for you to point at one of these stories and say, that's our story? Right? I mean, part of what critical race theorists were doing, were saying, I see that story of the founding fathers, that doesn't quite feel like our story. If you're white, is it harder for you to say that the story of the family fleeing lynchings, that's our story? Right? And if that's hard for you to do, I would ask you to investigate why, right? I mean, if you identified with the founding fathers, very few of us are descended from wealthy, propertied Englishmen. We've been asking non-white people to revere and identify with the founding fathers for generations, and that can work, right? But Lin-Manuel Miranda imagined, right, that the entire cast, right, could have been, you could see it through the eyes of people of color, right? So we could try that thought experiment in both directions. And that brings me to the close of this segment.
So what I want you to do for this exercise is think about yourself at a particular moment in time. And I've listed 12 or 21, age 12 or 21 or 50. I don't really care what age you pick, but those were some ideas that I thought that might be formative for people. And think about what awareness you had about what was going on for Black people or other people of color at that time. So my daughter, who's 25, says when she was in 2008, when she was, I don't know how old she was, a young teen, she remembers Obama being elected. That's what her sentence says, and she remembers that all of her Black classmates were excited about it. So I'm asking you to answer that question. And so I'm going to leave this up and let us take a look at this about people's awareness about what was going on for people of color. We're a wide age range here, so we may see some range of responses. I tried to do that for you and I stopped your video instead. This is really moving. In 1970, I remembered an extremely segregated life. In 1968, when I was 16, I remember Martin Luther King's assassination. In 1965, when I was 5 in the UK, I saw people being hosed by the police on TV and my parents being horrified that America was so brutal. Tom Sanborn. In 1986, oh, sorry, that's Tom's name. Sorry, Tom, put your name in the chat of the Zoom, thank you. At 15, my parents had a discussion about their experience with Black people while growing up. At 12, 1968 or thereabouts, I remember watching protests from Youngstown being broadcast on national news, and I felt their pain. At 2008, I was 22, and I remember then presidential candidate Obama coming to YSU. In 1965, when I was 5, I remember a Black girl in my class being excluded from a girls' group on the playground because no brown girls were allowed. In 1979, I was 21 and I was facing down the National Guard with 60 other Black students at college because we protested fraternities burning crosses outside our dorm rooms. I'm going to thank you all. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm just going to say, you know, what's the point of that exercise? And as we've been hearing and reflecting, it's hard for us to appreciate an alternative narrative or alternative story when we don't have much awareness of the alternative perspective or experience. So it's no surprise that we might resist a narrative that's different from the narrative that we grew up in and that we were surrounded by. And so how we see, how well we're able to see that another perspective even exists, you know, has a bearing on how we're able to understand competing narratives. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Brant.
You know, let me just add one other story to that. I thought some of those stories were really interesting. I recently heard this story when my parents in 1958 or 59 moved for a short 2-year position in Washington, D.C. from San Francisco. And then they went on little trips into the South, sightseeing trips, right? And they had no idea, right? The grandchildren or great-grandchildren of immigrants in San Francisco in Chinatown, right, had no idea about segregation in the South. And they were flummoxed when they got to places, and you know, there were colored and white restrooms, and they had to ask people, right, where do we go? Like, what do we do? And they were usually allowed to use the white restroom, right? But that was, I mean, just why would they know, right? If your life is segregated and you don't have any experience, you don't know. So when you hear all these stories and you think, wow, that sounds a lot worse than what I remember. Like, there isn't any reason, if we're in a segregated community, for us to know, right, what other people's experiences have been leading up to the time when you meet them, right? Okay, we have a little bit more to go, and there's going to be a break at 3:30, or approximately around there. So far, we have talked about why race is so hard to talk about, right? We have these narratives of merit and malice that make us defensive. We learned about critical race theory, and I emphasized how it reflected a different perspective on history, a different story being told about what the experience, what law was saying at the time, right? And I have sort of walked us through, right, some of these alternative perspectives. The next section, which I've kind of called the wages of democracy, this is about the consequences of what we're learning about racial inequality, right? We live in a democracy, and in democracy, the majority rules. And racially, the majority is still very much white, right? And if you're white and if you feel there's any way at all in which racial justice will make you give something up, right? Then if we're going to make things more fair, we're asking you to value the ideal of equality over your own self-interest, right? And none of us are used to that. We're used to a different storyline where there's a perspective, right? That's part of the merit perspective and the capitalism perspective, right? There's a perspective that says, if everyone acts in their own self-interest, then the market system will work things out. I look out for myself, you look out for yourself. That's not greed, that's taking responsibility for yourself. Things work better that way, everything will be fine, right? And if you perceive democracy as groups voting in their self-interest, then it is in a sense anti-democratic, or at least anti-majoritarian, right? To say that we should look out for the welfare of the minority, or that we should be concerned about, right, and support policies that reflect the interest of the minority. Like in a self-interested way, why should we do that, right? And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that, in fact, bringing about racial equality will make you give something up. There's actually a lot of good, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, I think, a lot of good ways in which bringing about racial equality will have benefits, right, for white people, right? But I'm just talking about sort of the feeling. If you have that sense, right, this impacts our very form of government, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Constitution. We've already talked about the 3/5 clause and slavery, which continued for another 70 years after the Constitution, right? And then after the Civil War, we adopted the Equal Protection Clause. And that's what I'm going to focus on here, right? Specifically adopted after slavery was abolished to protect Black people against formal government discrimination, right? That is the one explicit anti-discrimination provision, right, in the Constitution. And it says, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And what we're going to do in like 15 minutes, and if you're a con law professor out there, you're going to cringe. It's kind of speed talk through some key points, right, for people. And emphasizing, right, this is how the equal protection, this was our effort to make minority rights work under the Constitution in a democracy, the Equal Protection Clause, right? So I'm going to speed walk through these four, right, key Supreme Court decisions, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is the infamous case, right, where the Equal Protection Clause had been adopted. And throughout the South, there was nonetheless segregation. And you might wonder right at the outset how you could square equal protection of the laws with segregation by government entities, right? And the answer was that they said, well, it's true these facilities are separate, but they're still equal. And we're not saying anything about bad or about Black people. We're saying just as bad things about white people. We're saying neither Black nor white people should ride rail cars together or stay in hospital and hotels together, whatever, right? Whatever the venue was, or eat at restaurants together, right? Although, the tell in those policies that in fact they really were in one direction, at least there were lots of tells. One of them is, of course, that they were not at all equal, right? That's how you get segregated schools, is by pretending that you have equal schools, even though they're separate, right? But also, you actually could be Black and white in a white car if you were a servant, right? So it really did not, even in theory, right, go in both directions. So separate but equal. That's the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court, right, 120 years after the Constitution is adopted, right? And there's a famous dissent um, um, in which uh, uh, someone said, I disagree with this holding. I think this violates the Constitution. And that dissent invented the phrase colorblind, right? It said, our Constitution is colorblind. A minority, the losing opinion, nonetheless, sort of set up this concept. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Right. Second, Korematsu. Korematsu versus the United States is about the Japanese American internment. After Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese government invaded, right, raided Hawaii, right, the United States, President Roosevelt, right, the United States issued orders, Congress passed legislation, the whole bit, right, interning, rounding up 120,000 Japanese Americans living in the United States. 2/3 of them were citizens, right, American-born citizens. And they had to be American-born because at the time you could not become a citizen, right, if you were Asian. So, or you could not become a naturalized citizen if you were Asian. So, they challenged that in court, right? They said, how could this internment possibly be constitutional? You're singling people out by race, right? And locking them up. And ironically, the Supreme Court in Korematsu upholds the internment. And there's a long story there that we won't have time to get into. Upholds the internment, but at the same time, uses language that establishes, right, that there's going to be very strict scrutiny whenever there's a racial distinction made in a government act, right? The language was, all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. Courts must subject them to the most rigid scrutiny. And if a lawyer, you know that strict scrutiny, right, has often been fatal scrutiny. In fact, in other words, if you say that what you're doing is discriminating on the basis of race, that's going to be unconstitutional, right? In almost all cases, right? And that has been a useful precedent, again, ironically established in the case that upheld the specific use of race in a government act, right? We're going through time a little bit. 1896 was Plessy, 1945 is Korematsu, 1954 is Brown versus Board. I'm sure you've heard of this, right? Right. Brown versus Board is the end of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Brown versus Board said, you know what? We're finally going to recognize that separate is inherently unequal. Even if we imagine that they did get all the same resources or the same quality of education, we're going to say you cannot segregate if you're a government entity. I want to point out another aspect of Brown. The good thing they said was that to separate children from others of a similar age and qualifications just because of race, that's going to generate feelings of inferiority and will affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. They recognize the harm to Black children of school segregation. Right? Less well reported, you might think that if there's something that a government is doing that is unconstitutional and causing harm to children, that the result should be that states and government entities should have to stop doing that, right? And in the litigation that came after Brown versus Board, right, the litigation that was about how exactly are we going to desegregate schools, the court said, right, that we have to not throw society completely into chaos in doing this. We're going to have to do this in due time, right? We're going to have to do this. We should do it, right? But it's not going to be immediate, right? And as you may know, this conflict went on for decades, right? Where community after community was resisting, right? Massive resistance. There's a lot of communities in the South that established private schools, and all the white students, right, withdrew from the public school and went to the private school, right? And then they defunded the public school, right? So massive resistance and not immediate enforcement, right? I mean, you may remember sort of busing fights and so forth. Those came like in the 70s. So Brown versus Board, and then the last case I want to mention here is the University of California versus Bakke. This is the case that upheld affirmative action, right? And here's what's important about Bakke. Affirmative action, of course, is hotly contested. This is not really about the content of affirmative action or whether you think that's a good idea. But the reason affirmative action looks the way it does is because of Bakke, right? So the court said three things that I want to emphasize. They upheld affirmative action, but they said, in making this judgment, we're going to ignore the circumstances under which the 14th Amendment was passed, right? I want to point this out to you, right? We're interpreting the Equal Protection Clause. Equal Protection Clause was adopted right after the Civil War. The whole point of the Equal Protection Clause was to address the situation of Black people, especially in the South, right? And within that lifetime, right, like within a few years of when the 14th Amendment was passed, Congress, right, which set up the 14th Amendment, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, which was specifically to provide funds and support for newly freed slaves, right? They adopted a Civil Rights Act, which said a race word right in it, right? The Civil Rights Act, Section 1983 says all persons shall have the same rights as white persons, right? If the point of the Equal Protection Clause, right, was that we should not ever mention race in any public, right, in any public rule, right, the Congress that was there when the Equal Protection Clause was adopted, right, didn't follow that rule, right? And the court in Bakke said, well, yeah, that's true, but we've long moved past that. Now where we are is that we have these abstract concepts about equality that don't specify a purpose to help Black people, and we're going to interpret it that way, right, ahistorically. And then when they said, ultimately they said you can practice affirmative action, but only for particular reasons. You can't do it specifically to address societal or historic discrimination. You might know that that is happening all around and making the world unfair for Black people. But because you're making innocent white individuals like Bakke pay for something that they didn't do, they're not responsible for all of that historical and societal discrimination. You can't, right? You can't disadvantage that person even to address all of that. And you can't do it to deliver more services to underserved communities because you don't know if admitting students of color is the best way to do that. All the reasons why we might think, well, how do we address this? Maybe we could help people, right? The court says, no, you cannot adopt affirmative action for any of those reasons. So there's one reason, the court said, one purpose that you can legally have in mind, right, when you, if you are carrying out an affirmative action policy, is that if you're a school, you're allowed to have all sorts of purposes. You can have your goal be to train engineers, right, you can have your goal be to instill moral values, right? There's different colleges with different purposes. And Justice Powell, who wrote the main decision, the decision that counted in Bakke, said, the one permissible goal I see for affirmative action is that if a college decides their goal is to have a diverse student body, they have the academic freedom to have that as one of their goals, right? And because that's being presented as a pedagogical tool, we need a diverse student body so that we can teach in a way that gives everyone the benefit of all of those perspectives, right? So he says that's a permissible goal, right? Now, that's why, sometimes you might wonder why there's so much focus on diversity when, although diversity is important, it's like not always the most obvious. Well, it's like, what about justice? What about unfairness, right? Sort of other things that might also be important. And we sort of put all this emphasis on diversity. And one of the reasons we do that is because the Supreme Court has limited us, right? And trying to establish equal opportunity, we can only talk about diversity, at least in the realm of affirmative action, right? And so what happens is that if you're trying to adopt any kind of policy that you think might help to further equalize opportunities, you have to wedge all these things into diversity to say, yeah, what I'm doing is not about historical and societal events. What I'm doing is about diversity, because that's the guidelines the Supreme Court has set up that says that's permissible, right? That's the Constitution, right, as informed by, right, these different perspectives. And what the Constitution has done, what the Supreme Court has done, right, with regard to the majoritarian problem, right? We've now come, and this is Bakke, this is not just yesterday, this is like 45 years ago, right, 43 years ago, right? 43 years ago, we said, well, you know what? We're going to interpret the Equal Protection Clause adopted right after the Civil War to protect the majority, right, from having their rights infringed on in all but the most narrowly constricted circumstances, right? If a college decides that they think diversity is important. So, like, how exactly is it that in this democracy we're supposed to protect minority rights, right? I'm going to say one more thing. I'm not sure that, yeah. Before we break, we also have anti-discrimination legislation, right? And we might sort of wonder, well, that's also an effort for us to make sure that the minorities' rights are protected. Right? Does that legislation succeed in standing in the way of majority rule if majority rule could be oppressive, right? And what I want to point out about that is two things. One of them is that the return to something I mentioned when we were talking about critical race theory, right? The focus of those statutes is on intent. It's true, there is such a thing as disparate impact, which is about statistics, and you don't have to have intent nominally, right? But disparate impact lawsuits require the marshaling of statistics, and in most instances, we're not going to have the circumstances under which, right, you bring disparate impact. In most circumstances, you need to show that somebody was racist, right? That's the villain, right? And that's what white people are most defensive about, is being called a racist, right? And so in our discrimination law, it's generally the case that unless you can prove intentional racism, then there's not a harm that the law is going to recognize, right? You can't infer discrimination just because someone might believe in a stereotype. You have to prove they were being racist at the time that they made the decision that hurt you. They decided not to fire you. I mean, not to hire you, or to fire you, to demote you, right? Because, I mean, just because somebody, this is what the courts have said, right? Just because someone makes an inappropriate racial comment sometime 2 days earlier or 2 weeks earlier, that doesn't mean they were being racist at that time later, right? So that means it's really, really hard to get evidence that there's a kind of racism that the court will respond to, or that the law will respond to, right? And we all know, and this is what critical race theory helped to develop, right, that there's all these other things that produce unequal results, systemic outcomes, institutional traditions, right, unconscious biases, right? And generally speaking, except in very narrow circumstances, those things do not constitute discrimination, and our laws don't recognize them as a harm, and so our laws doesn't say to do anything about them. And here's why that's a problem. It's no consolation to the teenager who's in prison because the police patrol the street corner where he buys drugs, but not the dorm rooms where other people buy drugs, right? It's no consolation to him that there's not an individual racist police officer that resulted in him being the one wasting years of his life in prison, right? I don't think he thinks, oh, well, at least there wasn't a racist police officer, right? It's no consolation to the professional upper middle class Black woman attorney, right, living in a nice, expensive neighborhood, that her higher likelihood of miscarriage and maternal death or infant death are caused by a lifetime of racialized stress and trauma, and not by a racist doctor somewhere, right? I don't think she thinks, Well, at least there wasn't a racist behind it. She still loses her baby. He's still behind bars, right? They're not consoled, right? When we focus on finding the racist and then we don't find one, and then we decide, well, that means we don't have to do anything. That means that what's going on is a result of a lack of merit, right? So I don't mean this to be harsh. There are people consoled when we don't find an individual intentional racist who causes these bad outcomes. I'm not saying they like the bad outcomes. I'm saying they look at those bad outcomes, but then when they survey the field and the evidence, they see, oh, but there was no individual racist, right? Some white people are consoled. If they feel accused of being horrible, evil racist all the time, you feel better when it turns out that bad outcomes for Black people are not caused by that kind of racism, right? Not their fault, right? Now, that sounds harsh and I'm sorry for that, but I think it's true. If there's a little bit of you that is relieved when the evidence doesn't show a racist, right, an explicitly racist act or comment, right? You might wonder where that relief comes from, right? And I just want to remind us, so this is all under the structure of how is it that in a democracy, right, we're going to prevent minority interests from being oppressed, right, or minimized.
So before we take our break, I'm just going to set you up with the next question because you might want to think about it for a minute. And we just heard a lot about, you know, the majoritarianism, protecting the rights of the minority. How do we do that? And just as a point of reflection, we are at a place where there is a tension, right? We do have this whole group of, in fact, white people who are standing with Black people in thought and actually in action, right? To say Black Lives Matter, to say we're protesting, we're pushing the bound, we're trying to, you know, get outside of our white selves and get better at this. And we really do, you know, we're willing to take this on and figure it out and not always ask all the Black people to teach us. And so in that framework, you know, in some ways, this to me is the conversation about equity and equality that some of us have around all kinds of disparities that we see in our world. So what I want you to think about and reflect on and then share is a circumstance where something that's defined to benefit a minority group also benefits the majority group. So, so let me give you an example or two. So, so cut curbs, right? Cut curbs are designed to, you know, to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, help people who are disabled in terms of their mobility. And yet look at all of the people that targeted benefit also benefits. All of the bike riders, all of the moms with strollers, all of, you know, I don't know who else, well, older people, right? It's whole groups of people that benefit from this intervention that was designed to benefit a minority group. You know, there's lots of, I can think of lots of other things like that, you know, in Akron Public Schools, when my kids were there, I think it's still true. Everybody got a free lunch. Nobody got checked for income need because there was the percentage of children in need in Akron Public Schools is so high that administratively, it doesn't make sense to go through all that administrative nonsense for the small percentage of students who would not qualify. And I think there was grant money and whatever, but it was a targeted benefit for low income students to be able to get free breakfast and free lunch. but all of the kids benefited from it, and all of the families benefited. I could send my kid out the door in the morning and didn't have to worry about whether somebody was gonna feed him, or the fact that he didn't care if he ever had lunch, or the fact that he needed 2 lunches, so he ate the one that I made or he made, and ate the other one. So that's, again, a targeted benefit to a particular group that also benefited the majority group, benefited everybody. And the reason I raise this is because, there's a lot of, we always say, what do they say? Something lifts all boats. A rising tide lifts all boats, but it doesn't lift all boats. If you look at the way things that are not targeted interventions help, they actually increase the disparity between the people who have stuff and the people who don't have stuff. You actually have to target the people who are at the bottom, and that actually does lift all boats. These are really good examples. They're really great examples of how something that's targeted really does, its reach is broader than the target in a good way. Actually, it works that way in a bad way too, when you think about it. If you target a particular group for harsh consequences as opposed to a benefit, it does have a broader impact as well, which I think is something that I don't know, maybe there's some disagreement about that idea in general, but I would stand by it. So I think that we're gonna go ahead and get started again. I'm gonna say again, please put your name in the chat that offers to us the knowledge that you're back and engaged. I'm appreciating the person who said that they were struggling to answer because they are struggling to think of something that was targeting a minority group. We do have some really good examples. We do have some really good examples here to offer. And your idea about Medicaid, Medicaid is something for low income people, and the fact that we have healthy people in our society benefits the whole society, right? You have a workforce that can work. You have people who are not carrying around disease affecting everybody. You have and in fact, your other social safety net programs work better if you have been able to keep people healthy, because they need less dental care. They need less other kinds of specialized needs that are expensive. So that's you're on the right track. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and turn it over to Brant so we can so we can move forward.
All right, we are going to pick up where we left off. We have talked about how it is that everybody feels defensive entering a discussion about race. We've talked about how a bunch of scholars started to look at why the laws they were looking at intended to address racism, right, didn't seem to address the symptoms that they were seeing. And so they started to tell a different story. And then we walked through a different story, right, to see if we could understand where that would lead us. And then, we looked at how, if we're in a democracy and the majority is supposed to rule, how is it that our institutions protect us from exploiting a minority, right? We have the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. It's not really been interpreted in a way that, there's been good and bad, right? And we have anti-discrimination laws that focus really strongly on intentional conscious racism, right? Which, may not be the principal cause of racial inequality anymore, right? Unfair racial inequality, right? So we're moving on to the next little segment here, which is, well, so now let's look at what the current environment is composed of and what is going on right now. And one of what I want to start with is to talk about the fact that, in fact, the world is changing, right? There's been a lot of demographic change. And we've been hearing for some time now that the US is going to become majority minority, right, at some point in the future. And the future keeps getting closer. It tends to do that, right? So, here's the numbers, race numbers from the 2010 census 10 years ago, 11, well, now 12 years ago, right? And I want you to notice on each of these race categories, the census started to do something a little bit different, right? There are 3 bars, and the dark blue bar on top shows the people who said that they were that race alone on the race question, right? 72% of people identified themselves as white and nothing else, right? But there are these little gray bars where people are saying, they've been given the option now in the census forms, and they're starting to check off more than one box. So they might have checked white and something else, white and black, white and Asian. And so you see the lavender bar on the bottom of, and in each race category, right, shows the total. And in every race category, right, that race in combination, adding that, right, sort of makes the percentages all a little bit bigger, right? So, so that's 2010. And if you go to 2020, right, I don't have these set up right next to each other so you can see, but I will tell you, right, that the number of people reporting their race as white only decreased, right, not just in percentage, but in absolute numbers, decreased by about 20 million, and their percentage of the population dropped by about 10 percentage points, 72% to about 62%, right? And that might feel like a lot, but there's some really interesting things going on here, right? People are starting to think about their racial identity differently, right? The number of people who said they were white and some other race, it's still not that big a number, but it almost tripled. Actually, it more than tripled, right? Look at that, it's almost 10%, right? So the total of people who are white or partly white actually increased, right? Now the percentage still dropped a little bit from of that total number, right, from 75% to about 71%. Let me just pause here. There have been a lot of studies about whether or not people who are white feel threatened by the prospect of, becoming a majority minority country. 71% is a lot. Speaking as an Asian, we're 7%, right? Black people about 12.5%, Hispanic or Latino up a lot to almost 19%, right? Up from 16%, right? None of those numbers are even of what is it, a fifth, right? Well, I guess Hispanic is maybe more than a fifth, but they're all very small compared to the number of people who are white. So, even if you just look at whites only, 62%, that's still 5 times as many as there are black people, right? So the only way it makes sense to feel threatened at 60 or 70% when no other group is even 20% is if you're used to being in an even bigger majority, right? And you take that for granted. You take for granted that your culture is the general culture. Your votes decide elections. The other people are the ones that do the assimilating, right? And if you do feel threatened, right, then you might be more inclined to defend the traditional narrative, right? And let me just say a few things about how this decline, even the 72 to 62% decline, right, of in the white only category, that's more complicated than it looked, because it's not that there are that many fewer people, right? What happened is people changed, at least a fair number of people changed how they recorded their race, right? So, it used to be that if you were a little bit black, anything other than pure white, then you're not white, right? And that's an idea from a racist time when one drop of non-white blood was thought to contaminate you, right? And white was the pureness standard, right? By the way, if you're feeling like all those people who said they were white and something else are not really white, you just might examine that idea a little bit, right, and see where it comes from. So now more people who used to say they were just white are saying they're white and something else, right? And I think part of it is that it's now cool in some places, or at least no longer a shameful secret, right, to say that you are part of something else, right? And the Hispanic category throws a wrench in those numbers too, because of the 71% who are at least some white, 10 of those percentage points are white, Hispanic, or Latino people, right? So if you don't really think of Hispanics or Latinos as white, now we're back down to 61%, right? You know, in 2010, a little over half of Hispanics said that they were white alone, right? So, and in 2020, that number was 20%. So it went from over 50% to 20%. That's a huge decrease in the number of Hispanics who said that they were only white. And the number of Hispanics who said they were two or more races multiplied by 5%. That's not because that in those 10 years, the Hispanic population actually changed that much, right? It's what they're reporting. So Latino people who are used to thinking of themselves as white, now starting to think themselves a little bit differently, right? But the reason we're walking through any of this, right, is that one of the issues that race issues are becoming more heated, right, is because of changing demographics and shifting racial identities, making some white people at least feel nervous, right, about being outnumbered and perhaps losing social status. A second reason, I think, to give us background before we start to get into some of the events that are happening, I do think that all of this academic attention, none of which is very new, even critical race theory sort of follows history and political science, sociology, right? Social psychology has been working on for decades. Some of that is finally filtering down to the general public and into the educational system, right? This is the New York Times paperback nonfiction bestseller list from September of 2020, right? All 10 of the top 10 on this list were trade books, right? Nonfiction books for the public, general public, not academic books, right? That were about race, that all of these books talk a little bit about all of these things that we've talked about, a different perspective, right? And people are buying those books, right? So teachers, filmmakers, politicians, textbook authors, ordinary people are starting to know more about our racially oppressive past and a little more about how that past connects with the present. Maybe they learned it in college, right? Now they're actually starting to change the books and the school lessons and the movies, you know, at least somewhat. So, you know, when critics of critical race theories say there's this plot to indoctrinate our children, I mean, I wouldn't characterize it in the nasty, sort of hostile, hateful way that it's been described, but I think that there's some truth to the fact that different perspectives are now being reflected, right, in school curriculum, right? So we have sort of all this information finally filtering down a little bit more. We have demographic change causing people to be nervous, right? So you can sort of see this clash, right? Conflict building up, right? Summer of 2020, right? In the context after we all watched the killing of George Floyd on video, right? These passionate protests throughout the country under the banner of Black Lives Matter. You know, by some measures, the largest public demonstration in the world, right? And certainly the largest movement in US history. So here's this, those who are starting to understand about how racial inequality works, getting more of a voice, people who might be defending the traditional narrative, feeling more threatened, right? And so it's in that context, right, that you get this this debate. And I just picked these cover pictures because they're such sort of opposites on a scale. Because the 1619 Project, which are specifically named by many critics of critical race theory as being the bad thing, right? 16, published by the New York Times, and Nicole Hannah-Jones. And if you have not looked at this, there's now a book version. I really do recommend it. But there's a premise set out that we should think about America differently. We should think about America starting in 1619 when slavery came. And you know, at least a part of the thesis is about how central slavery has been in the formation of America, right? In the entire first century of our economic development, right? And we now understand that after the Civil War, slavery, this is Brian Stevenson's line, slavery didn't end, it evolved, right? We first sort of figured out how to make it keep working without calling it slavery, at least right in some places. So the 1619 project is this, it does have a pedagogical goal. They have created specific curriculum for teachers to use in classrooms, right? And at least partly in response to that, well, I think in response to that, it's fair to say, you know, President Trump established the 1776 Commission. The idea there was to recenter, reaffirm, right, the centrality of the founding as the, you know, quintessential achievement of America. This is what America is all about. And sort of repudiate, at least saying that they were repudiating, right, the idea that the United States is an evil country. Well, let me just pause here for a minute. Is the United States fundamentally racist? Right. You know, when I first, actually, we're about to take a look at the executive order. We mentioned this before. This is the executive order on race and sex stereotyping from President Trump. And when I first looked at it, a lot of the things that it mentioned, I thought, well, you know what, this is not really a problem. You know, you're not allowed to teach certain things. This is an executive order, so it applies to federal contractors and federal government entities, right? Here's the things that you're not allowed to teach. That one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. I thought, yeah, that's fine. I'm not going to teach that. That the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. I'm going to come back to that one. That an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. You can't teach that things are happening unconsciously, right? That an individual should be discriminated against solely because of their race or sex. That meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by a particular race to oppress another race. You can't teach any of those things. And you know, as stated, they're stated in such extreme language, right? That I looked at this and I thought, this is fine. I'm just going to ignore this because I don't teach any of these things. But I do want to pause on that second one that I mentioned, that the United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. Right? Fundamentally racist or sexist is not a fact, right? That is a judgment about what is most important about a country, or at least about a country's history, right? It seems to me that on the facts, you could certainly make the argument that that has been made, right? The traditional argument that we enshrine some really important universal concepts and ideals, which actually I do believe that we did that, right? There are some really important ideals established in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, although so not carried out for many years. But when we point out the number, I mean, the 3/5 clause is the least of it, the number of provisions in the Constitution that either directly or indirectly, right, affirm slavery or rely on slavery, right? There's dozens. And so it seems to me that if someone wanted to say, no, racism is fundamental to America, because look at their founding document, right? I don't see how you could say that that's not a perspective that is even possible to rationally have. Right? It is at least possible to rationally have that perspective. especially if you identify with the people who were enslaved, right, at the time. So there's some ways in which what they're trying to prohibit a perspective, an opinion, right? And so, which has, you know, all sorts of issues, right, with it. Let me talk about some other things that have happened as far as sort of more like events, and right. So here's a language about what counts as a divisive concept, highlighting the fundamentally racist line, right? This is a bill in Ohio. There have been 2 bills introduced in Ohio that purport to prohibit the teaching of critical race theory in our schools. And I've already said that it's hard to sort of narrow down exactly what critical race theory is. And that the way that they're defined, and because this bill uses a lot of the language from the president's executive order, so a lot of them are the same thing. What exactly that these bills will accomplish, right? If we think that we're not really teaching any of those things, and it's really unclear what critical race theory is. But here's what I'm afraid of, right? This is the letterhead of a group called Moms for Liberty in Tennessee. And there is a chapter in Ohio, right? Actually, there are several chapters in Ohio. And Moms for Liberty is in Tennessee. Tennessee already passed this legislation, right? So they wrote a letter saying, these are the things that we object to. These are the things that we don't want taught in our schools anymore. This is critical race theory, right? It's really handy to have a letter like that, right? Because now we know, let's see what they think. Because we know that they're not going to show that these law review articles are being taught in elementary school. So what is it exactly that they're complaining about here, right? So here's what they're complaining about. These are the books listed, right, in the letter from the Moms for Liberty about as books that teach critical race theory. These are books that, and here's what they sort of specifically objected to, right, in the language. They say that pages 2 and 3 of the Ruby Bridges book, right, depicts a photograph of a neighborhood sign that says, "We want white tenants in our white community," and a picture of a smiling white boy holding a sign that says, "We won't go to school with Negroes." Right? Those are pictures, those are historical pictures that actually happened, right? And in the Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington book, right, this is a chapter of books, the letter from the Moms for Liberty says pages 22 and 23 show photographs of white firemen blasting black children to the point of bruising their bodies and ripping off their clothes. Right? And what the letter says, these books do, and those particular things, those particular photographs do, the letter says those pictures make children hate their country, each other, or themselves. Right? They say that these books amplify and sow feelings of resentment, shame of one's skin color, and or fear. So let me ask you, actually, there's one more example I have here. This is recent, right? This is a book that was recently banned. It's The New Kid. It's a graphic novel that won awards, as you can see from the cover, right? And you know, one of the parents who was campaigning to get this book banned said, it is inappropriate instructional material. The books don't come out and say we want white children to feel like oppressors, but that is absolutely what they will do. So here's my question. You have just heard a lot of fairly harsh facts about our history, like, in fact, harsher than the facts reflected in these books. Many of you are white. Do you feel like this presentation and I, a self-professed critical race theorist, are trying to make you feel like oppressors, right? That this material inherently, right, causes white people to, let's see, what's the language? Hate their country, each other, and or themselves, or feel resentment or shame of one's skin color or fear. Right? And I have to say, I'm taking a risk. They say that you should never ask a question that you don't know the answer to. I have not articulated this all that clearly in my own mind. It does seem, I mean, that you might feel, I mean, I feel bad. I'm not white. I don't identify as white. I feel bad when I read that history. And maybe even, I would even use the word ashamed of our country as a, right? I don't feel that as an Asian person or even as a non-Black person. I feel it as an American that these things happened, that more people don't know about them, right? So if you feel that negativity and you don't think that carefully about it, you might think that negativity might come out as what they're describing. But you know, there's a historian who chimed in on this particular one, who said, you know, this is Kevin Cruz. He says, you know, if you're worried that your children will read a book and have no choice but to identify with the villains in it, right? Maybe that's something you need to work through on your own, right? That, as I say, I do think that there's something to the idea. You know, I actually read New Kid, this graphic novel, and I just think it's a little amazing what people focus on, because this book, I was looking for it knowing that people were objecting, so I was looking for where it might show people as evil, right? This book does not show white people as evil. It shows how difficult it can be for a Black child attending a new, private, mostly white school, right? And the kids and the teachers are a range of nice and cruel, and there are villains. They're mean in the way that children can be mean, right? Some kids are sensitive and observant. Some kids are clueless. There's a white boy who's a jerk and a bully, who is identified that way by the other white students as well, right? This is a book about adolescence, and there are people being mean, and Black people in this school experience that in a different way, right? In addition to the ordinary kind of bullying, right? They have, you know, the experience of being called the name of the other Black kid in school, right, over and over again. Even the Black teacher in school is called the name of another Black adult, right, in the institution, a Black teacher who's been working at the school for 14 years, right? Those are descriptions of things that happen. And if you feel like the only way to be a good person is never to have done any of those things, and if you do one of those things that you're an oppressor, then I suppose that is how those books might make you feel, right? The reason I'm bringing this up is that it's not necessarily the direct items in the curriculum that will be prohibited because of the legislation. It's because of the chilling effect, right? It's because of, you know, if I'm a superintendent of a small school district and my school board meetings are chaos, and if I'm the principal of a school and there's been complaints, and I don't know that much about it, or maybe even if I do know a lot about it, so much easier to just say, well, why don't we just not teach that book, right? Than to make a lot of parents mad, right? Why take that on? There aren't even that many Black children in our school. They might think. You know, there's a way in which, I mean, I would want them to stand up and take a strong stance, of course, right? I totally understand why a superintendent would make that decision, right? They have a lot of issues to deal with, right? So that's what I'm concerned about, right? Even in these schools, like they're going to take some of these books out, and if not through any formal process, but through kind of an informal process, right? One other thing I'm going to talk about before we move on from this section. Actually, a couple of things. I'm just forgetting. 2 things. I always have more than one other thing. One of them is other ways in which this is playing out. So we talked about legislation, we talked about school boards. The Ohio State Board of Education in the summer of 2020 adopted a pretty strong resolution against racism, right? Including reference to some curriculum and some and recommending diversity training for employees. And in 2021, the Board of Education repealed their own resolution against racism because they were concerned that the reference to requiring diversity training was going to require critical race theory indoctrination. Right? The Ohio Board of Education is not a venue at which we are used to political fights being fought. Those are elected officials, right? But this fight takes place at a lot of different levels. Right? So you might have to pay more attention to things. I mean, one of the reasons why some of the people following the legislative prospects for these bills, one of the reasons why they say, well, these bills might not pass is because the supporters of the bill might think, this is all like third hand, right? They might think that the State Board of Education will do the dirty work for them, and fewer people are paying attention, right? The other thing I wanted to ask or to talk about is this: the couching of all of this material in like not teaching divisive concepts. Divisive is a really interesting word to use there, right? The objects of the complaint are items of education that were not traditionally included and are not part of the mainstream narrative, right? And if you're attached to the mainstream narrative, this divides people who like the mainstream narrative, right? Because some people will say, oh yeah, I want that in, and other people will say, I didn't want that. And why did you introduce that idea at all? Because now we're fighting about something that, before didn't seem to me like we were fighting about it. And what I want to point out is the lack of a fight prior to this being raised did not signify unity, right? The students of color whose stories were not reflected in the mainstream narrative, or at least not reflected in a way that explained their world to them, right? Those students were already divided from the rest of the class. Right? And if you're talking about making people feel bad, let me ask you this: how do you think you're supposed to feel if you are an adolescent or teenage Black male, and you look at the world around you and see all of this inequality, and what the narrative tells you, what the mainstream tells you, is that America is a meritocracy. America rewards everyone according to their merit, their skill, and their hard work. If you're doing well in America, it's because you have merit. And if you're doing poorly in America, it's because you lack it. And many of these legislative and other legal efforts are about defending meritocracy, right, from criticism. There have actually been psychological studies about the effect of being taught that meritocracy works, right? Because if you're Black and you look around and you see that your community lacks what white communities have, and you're taught that America is a meritocracy, I don't see how you cannot reach a conclusion, right, that your community lacks merit, right, which leads to disinvestment, disengagement, right, and other deleterious effects. That's the situation that is addressed by including more news stories that help to explain why you might feel the way you feel and why a society might look like the way it looks. Some of these stories are helping children of color feel seen for the very first time, right? And those efforts are causing, the fact that those small efforts are causing a decent number, I think still a minority, but a decent number of white students, white parents to feel, right, that those are hateful things to include in the school curriculum, right? That to me is cause for concern. I would frame it like this. You know, what these things are supposed to teach. I don't know. How do you think books about, what do you think books about Pearl Harbor teach Japanese American citizens? Do you think it teaches them that they identify with the bad guy? Right. What do you think the Diary of Anne Frank teaches about Germans? What do you think Little House on the Prairie teaches about Native Americans? Right. If we're going to say that stories that cast people in a bad light oppress them, we've been doing that the whole time. So that is my wrap up of what does the current environment looks like. The fights are happening at the level of curriculum in the school, at legislative and administrative levels, and also in informal channels. And at the crux of it, it's individual parents feeling bad when they read certain stories that present a different narrative. Right? So where do we go from here? So we started the day recognizing that many white people enter the discussion about racism, about race, feeling accused of being racist. And many Black people enter the discussion feeling accused of being inferior. And we learned that critical race theory is and was an academic movement among legal scholars who were responding to a legal landscape that didn't capture the experience of people of color, especially Black people. And we looked at how the way that different perspective intersects with the way our democracy is set up, to the extent that it is set up at all to protect minority rights, right? That alternative narrative being presented critiques democracy, critiques the way democracy is running right now. And we've seen how the current environment is just primed for conflict, right, on this issue. One of the things I want to find this piece that I put away. To talk about at this point. So my pages are out of order.
Mine are stapled.
No, I got it. Part of what's going on, and this is about, so I'm going to try to say three things, and then I don't know, if we have time to take questions and things. One, I've been developing this theme about how democracy is supposed to respond. One of the things that's happening, I think, with all of these systems that we're discovering is that even if you have a statute that worked, even if we said, okay, there's no more discrimination is allowed. Let's even say that worked. No more discrimination. Anytime you have a policy, I mean, if you when the majority of the country is that big a majority, 60 or 70% of the whole thing, right? Anytime you have a policy like affirmative action or even anti-discrimination law, that many or most white people perceive, perhaps inaccurately, as being against their self-interest, our system is designed in 1,000 ways to reflect the perspective of the majority, right? It's not just that those laws are still in place, right? Their votes elect leaders, their viewership shapes news, their choices define neighborhoods, their attention curates our education, our entertainment choices, right? They determine the images that get presented. Their buying power is the demand that delivers goods and moves markets, right? The judges who are going to interpret those statutes, right, are going to at some point reflect the politics of the people who appointed them. The people who appointed them are going to be elected people elected by the majority, right? So to think that there was ever going to be a bulwark, refuge against, even if the majority wanted something, you're not going to be able to get it, was always a myth, at least to some extent. Over time, all of those forces are going to produce, right, what the majority wants. And so the key thing here, right, is, somebody else said this, I forget who it was. Oh, I think it's Chris Rock. We have the best white people we've ever had. Right? Together with large majorities of people of color, still a majority. Right? It's been a long time since a majority of white people, right, voted in a different way. But a large enough minority of white people is essential, right, to the idea that you could have counter-majoritarian, right, protection. Right? We are trying to shift that all those cultural forces. That is an incredibly hard thing to do. One of the things about learning about systems is that they're really hard to move. And then so in retrospect, you realize, oh, actually we've done really well given how hard it was, right? I mean, even right now, the majority of people still support Black Lives Matter, right? Even after sustained month-long period where images of white people were images of protest, not that positive, right? Approval by white people has gone down a fair amount, right? I'm not trying to be too Pollyannish about this, right? But still a majority, right? So that's the first thing, that we're struggling against numbers, and it's not easy, right? The second thing I want to say is that, critical race theory did have broad influence. I'm not somebody who says the fact that elementary schools are not assigning law reviews means there's no critical race theory in the schools. Its influence is there. They're not wrong about that. But part of what's happening is that the historians and sociologists and legal scholars, right, they've been learning and writing about this for decades. That's getting into the schools. That's also a big systemic thing that's going to be hard to stop. This is a rear guard action. They're trying to stop something where, there's some ways in which the train has left, right? That's at least, I'm going to glass half full kind of person. Right? So now, I think I tried to number them, and I've said 2 things. I'm going to say I have 2 more, and then that's the end. And then we'll have maybe some time for questions. Oh, you have a Mentimeter, and then yeah, okay. One of them is, you know, if you are especially sensitive to the idea that someone's going to inaccurately call you a racist or going to say that you're racist because bad things are happening to Black people, critical race theory, appropriately understood, is actually your friend, right? I have been describing how critical race theorists, the whole point of it was to articulate how you could have the production of racial inequality, right? Even though there's no individual racist person intending harm. That lets you off the hook. That says, but it acknowledges the inequality. It says, we don't have to call you a racist. All we have to do is recognize that we nonetheless have a system in place that is causing inequality to be produced and maintained. Can you help us fix that? Right? You don't have to feel like, oh, I'm not going to help you because I didn't do that. And none of us did that. Right? Still may be worthy if you find it in your heart to be generous, right? To help somebody who is on the losing end of so many different measures of equality. Right? Critical race theory is your friend. And then the second last thing is to kind of bring empathy to the table, right? More explicitly even. I've asked you, right, can you put yourself in the shoes of people of color, of escaping slaves, of people terrorized by lynchings? And it's hard, right, to do that, especially if you're feeling threatened. But one of the things that I have noticed, because I'm Asian, and so I'm kind of in between, so sometimes I get to see things. One of the things that I have noticed is that, you know, everybody points the finger and says, both sides, everybody points the finger and says, you're not being generous. You're not being compassionate. You're not being grateful, right? You know, from the majority, it sounds a little different, right? It's, you're not grateful for what you have. You're not that bad off. You should be more grateful. You should have a better attitude. Should be more, right? And the finger pointing the other way also says, look at all the things you have. You should be more grateful. Why are you holding on to it so tightly, right? And yet, in their own private lives, in their churches, and I have seen, right, in Black churches and white churches, right, people come to the pulpit or stand up in front of the congregation and say, I'm so grateful for everything that I have. I owe it all, right? This is not about Christianity, right? This is about the fact that I know that people fighting this fight, pointing the finger at each other in other aspects of their lives have humility and gratitude and generosity as core values. And there's some reason why when we come to certain issues, we turn that off, right? And if we can, the reason I'm saying that's hopeful is that it's already there, right? We just need to connect it in some way. It's been unnaturally unconnected, right? And I'd like to think that we will get there. I thought of another last thing, but I'm going to not present it. Maybe we'll get to it in the questions.
Okay, so we're going to go to Q&A, and so here's what you want to do. Those of you wanting legal CLE credit should put your name in the chat, and everybody should. This is our last Menti question. You all have been great sports about using the technology. Thank you. happy to have your feedback on that. And while you're doing that, or after you put in a comment, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and Brant can start looking at them, and Mark can help curate that as well. So I will bring up the Menti screen as soon as I get it where it needs to be. I've learned what critical race theory is and how we should mark it as a friend and not foe. I'm seeing that CRT would help us move away from blaming people and instead look at this as a problem that nobody is currently actively causing, but still something we can try to fix. I take away a much better understanding of critical race theory and related topics, as well as much food for thought. Thank you. The merit versus malice argument framework, I really like framing CRT as win-win. Sorry, I lost that one. Racism persists as a defense of white meritocracy. Hadn't made that direct connection before. A willingness to have empathy. All right, I'm going to just let these scroll so that, are you looking at questions? Do you want to take any of them on?
Actually, I don't see many new questions. I see a bunch of other ones that I feel like we have covered a fair amount of it. Let me just say this, in terms of actual practical things, what's next? Once you decide that color blindness alone, right, the lack of ongoing intentional discrimination alone is not going to reverse all of the deficits that have been created by our policies in the past, then you have to decide about changing policy going forward. And one of the, I have mentioned it kind of in abstract in that last point about how we might all benefit. Marie asked the question earlier, policies that might benefit everyone, right? I'm going to emphasize how that's true in two ways. And then I'm going to talk about good things that are happening, right? The two ways are this. There's a book, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, really good, that talks about how we were so determined to maintain racial segregation that we hurt ourselves. And when I say we, I mean the whole community, but white people too, right? And her, the central organizing image that she's got, which I think is just really powerful, is she talks about the number of communities that were having had developed over, in the post-war period, community swimming pools where the whole community could congregate and gather and enjoy themselves. And then after Brown versus Board, the communities could no longer have segregated pools. But rather than integrating them, what communities did was close them, right? Like that is a harm that white people imposed on their own communities in order to avoid integration. Scared white people, not all white people, right? Defunded their community's public schools, right? Because there was going to be integration. And in some of those communities, they filled the swimming pool with cement. So no one could get the benefit of that swimming pool. And I have to say, I have not researched the history of Akron, Ohio, where I live. But when we arrived in Akron, we were looking for the community pools. And we noticed, and we asked our friends where they swim in the summer. And where they swim is at a private tennis club, at the Jewish Community Center, or at the local country club, right? They have memberships there. And nobody is there who's signing up for those things is racist or even aware of the history of what happened to our community's pools, right? We recently did rehabilitate 2 public pools, which had been in some disrepair, right? But sort of thinking of the losses we could avoid, right, is one way to think about the benefits. And the other way to think about it is this. You know, there are certain aspects of meritocracy, I think, that are obviously true, which is to say, in a particular instance, when one person is working harder or performing better, as between those two people, right? In one particular instance, they might get better outcomes, right? In the big picture, our commitment to the idea of meritocracy, because the United States has a particularly cruel and harsh form of capitalism. It's not capitalism itself; it's the version of it that we have, right? That says, you need to it's like everything's got to be you on your own, being responsible for yourself. Students, we're no longer going to support public universities. We're going to make you take out all these loans, right? And the feeling, the whole concept that you have to take care of yourself and the community is not there to help you, right? That arises out of a harsh form of meritocracy that says even your ability to attend a better school that's assigned to you because of the neighborhood that you live in and you can't afford to get out of, even that's part of meritocracy somehow, right? And that happens, I think, at least a large part because of the defensiveness about meritocracy that we have, right? In the whole merit versus malice thing, right? We're sort of extra committed to that because we're afraid of because we're defensive about race. And if we could let go of that, meritocracy is driving us, again, the harsh form of meritocracy that we have is causing even upper middle class white people to be miserable, right? To be, forcing their children to take SAT classes on their weekends, right? In this sort of never-ending competition to make sure that you stay ahead. Right? I think, and this is starting to get into, fundamental values, and I'm not your priest or anything, right? I think we would all be better off if we were a little bit less focused on how to get ahead and a little bit more focused on how to be part of a community. Right? And I think, and I mentioned I would say something about things that are happening. Things are happening, right? In 2020, you might remember that all these organizations were issuing statements, right? And some of them came with money, right? And who was it? I think it was the chief executive of Netflix, who said they were going to move $100 million worth of Netflix's cash assets into Black-owned banks, right? Mackenzie Scott, after she got her divorce settlement from Jeff Bezos, right, started to give away money, billions and billions of dollars. She's given away money, right? I think the first round of gifts was $6 billion that she gave away. And by the way wealth works in the USA, she now has more than she had when she started giving it away. Right? So we don't have to cry for Mackenzie Scott. But when she did that, she specifically identified historically Black colleges and universities and civil rights groups to receive large chunks of that money, right? Why are they doing that? Is it because Mackenzie Scott feels like she's responsible for slavery? Is it because Netflix is responsible, right, for slavery? They're doing that because they see an inequality that they can address, whether or not, and that's not because they were responsible. So in my mind, that is a form of reparations, right? It's not the kind that says you have to pay because you're responsible. It's the kind that says we have to help people who were unfairly held down because of our country's actions, right? And I think that that's starting to happen at least more than it used to. Let's see, lots of responses.
I think we need to check in with Mark and see how we're doing on time. And I don't really remember what
last comments. Yeah.
I think right now we've got till, technically this is 5 o'clock. So there's 7 minutes. There's 7 minutes left, I guess, according to the, toward what was sent out. I just like to comment while I'm here. I think one of the things found a number. This is interesting. I want to thank both of you for this fantastic presentation. One of the things I found interesting is why, when you're asking the question why people have a problem with the revised form of history, and I asking myself why I don't, and I think there's the analogy that keeps coming to mind when I hear this is the sort of feeling you get when you realize your parents aren't perfect, when they don't have all the answers. And so you go through life with this sort of certainty, right, that there's always somebody there that has the right answer. They're at heart good and have your interest at heart. And then all of a sudden you realize one day, yeah, they're human beings like everyone else. They have their flaws. You don't get rid of your parents. I hope you don't get rid of your parents just because you realize that. But at the same time, you come to sort of an adult understanding of what the reality is, right? There's good parts and bad parts to everyone. You hope that the good parts come out more than the bad. And it seems that's what people grapple. It's when they want this sort of very simplistic, easy way to just say, we're a good nation, we're exceptional, we have these ideals and we live up to those. And you can see we've made all this progress. And you just don't want to let go of, in some ways, a sort of childish view of where we come from, and when you get to that adult view, you're like, yeah, it's not perfect, but that's okay that it's not perfect, right? It's okay. You don't have to feel bad about that. And that's everything you were saying. I was like, why is it that people have such a reaction? And that's the reaction I see. It's almost like trying to grapple with that recognition that it's not perfect, just like a parent is not perfect.
No, that's really interesting, Mark. What that makes me think of is how, for many people in their own personal lives, learning to forgive yourself, right? Really big step. Maybe that's what the nation needs, right? To learn to like, yes, having done bad things does not make you a bad country.
There is a question. I'm just going to read. Does the fact that something is different in another person or group play a factor in critical race theory? Example, skin color is different, not like mine, I form a prejudice. So is it the difference in another person play some factor in critical race theory?
There's so many different directions to go with that. There's a fair amount of sort of psychology work about the extent to which it's a little bit natural for there to be an us them, and that we need to identify threats. This is sort of at the evolutionary biological level, right? We need to identify threats, and color is one of those things that you can identify, right? But the thing about that is, and I don't know if this is where that comment was coming from. The thing about that is, the other thing that we've also learned is that the way we interpret color is so socially constructed, right? When I started off saying, talking about how, one drop of blackness destroyed your whiteness, and so it became possible to say things like, be careful, that person looks white, but they're really not. Like, where is that in the idea that it's skin color that's making the difference, right? We had laws that the reason loving versus loving came about was because, because black was defined differently from state to state. Is it going to be the one drop rule, or is it going to be the 1/16th rule? And the lovings, right, changed race when they crossed state lines, and that's how they were able to get married, right? So I don't think there's nothing to the idea that something simple and visual and physical might cause a categorization to happen. But to think that it's such a sort of a fundamental or essential categorization, right, that along with that might also come physical prowess and sexuality and intellectual, like, to think that that's one thing is linked to all of these other things is part of the myth of what race consists of. So it's sort of to disentangle what's right about that and what you have to be careful of.
There's another question. There's one that just popped up. Has there been any attempt to apply critical race theory to intersectionality?
Intersectionality comes out of critical race theory. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's the person who's actually credited with coining the term critical race theory, she's also the person who wrote the first two law review articles that kind of put intersectionality on the map, because her first law review article was about how Black women in particular suffer a different kind of sexism and a different kind of racism than just adding them together, right? Which is kind of the core of intersectionality, right? That each of those things is a different thing. And so they are absolutely linked. You know, I saw a question in here about the term critical race theory.
I was going to tell you about that one.
Yeah, I just think that's a good one to you know, maybe end on. And I don't know if you have any closing comments that you have to make. Sometimes when words get so ingrained in people's minds that it means something, then it starts to become not worth it to fight that battle. Let's fight on the substance, right? So I could imagine, and sometimes in the last year, I have sometimes thought, let's not defend critical race theory. Let's not, you know, take on all of that baggage that has been created. Let's just say, here's what I believe, right? Here's what, you know, here's some good things and here's some bad things, right? Here are some things that we now understand about the systemic production of inequality. And even in saying that, I myself personally, in teaching these classes, I tend to use the word racism less, because racism also is one of those words that triggers people, that causes them to be defensive. So what I just said was the systemic production of racial inequality, right? That's not systemic racism, because sometimes people hear systemic racism, don't really know what it means. They think it means everyone in the system is consciously racist, which is not what it means, right? And rather than explain all of that, right, I have started to not use that word, right? Now, I have no qualms or no fight against someone who says, no, this is absolutely racism and we should use that word, right? I understand that perspective entirely. It's just not an approach that will reach some people, and I still have it in mind that I might be able to reach those people. So, so yes, using certain words less might help, but you know, it's also kind of giving up the fight, so like, right, when in fact you think it's inaccurate. You know, so words matter, but maybe we can make them mean what we want them to mean.
I find it very interesting that something that I learned almost 30 years ago in my philosophy of law class is only now causing this kind of, I mean, critical race theory never, I mean, I've known about this concept. I've read readings in the early works. You know, this was 25, 30 years ago as an undergrad. This is not new, and it's not particularly controversial, at least in academic circles. There's not much about it that said, you know, there aren't a lot of people who really object. And the fact that we now have to keep changing terms, I almost get, there's almost a, look, I'm going to just be honest. I think it's almost an academic irritation. Like, really, you can't do enough of your homework just to realize that, one, this isn't new. Two, you really don't understand what it is, and that it's not one theory. It's many different views about how we should approach these topics. And it was confined primarily to law when I was studying. It was primarily a legal sort of theory approach to law and making of laws. So I almost, sometimes it's almost annoying, the idea that you would have to change something that's been around for so long and change your language in this, you know, do these sort of, you know, how linguistic, you know, twists and turns sort of yoga that you have to do to get into a position where you say, okay, now I can say this, so it doesn't sound too much like that thing that everyone hasn't taken the time to really explore. But that's my own personal irritation with it, I think. I think
I share that.
Is it, let's see, we have one more question. Oh, it's the evaluate. Okay, so I think with that, we're just going to have to wrap it up. So I see the evaluation of the event is on here. If the participants would do it. I want to thank Brant and Marie for a fantastic presentation. I know we have probably a virtual applause somewhere. I don't think anyone's emoting, but if you want to raise your hands or something, that would be fine for the virtual applause. And I want to thank again the Mahoning Foundation for co-sponsoring this and actually doing it. I was lucky. I got the easy part of this job was just setting up the virtual room, finding, you know, making sure Brant and Marie were available, and they did all the legwork of making sure everybody got the emails and the announcements and the advertisements. So I want to thank them for all their work that they did on their end. And so with that, I'll leave. If you want any closing comments from you or Marie or anyone else, that'd be fine.
I just think we got really lucky that we had moved this to virtual 2 weeks ago.
Oh, right.
I'm not going to lie. This is probably for those who are in the, who they're attending. If you've been to the other, we've had very good attendance at others, but this is probably the largest we've had in the last several years. So there is some, I don't, these words are going to come out of my mouth and I'm hating myself right now, but this was almost a good thing that we had to do it virtually because it really opened it up to a lot of people who I suspect would not have been able to attend because you're not in the area or because of the weather and any number of reasons. So I'm actually very happy the number of people who got to experience the webinar.
And I'd just like to say thank you to Marie and Brant as well. This was fabulous.
Thanks. It was a, it's a labor of love to put these together.
So, and really thanks for inviting us back after you've already heard our spiel so many times.
Oh, but a different focus each time, and we appreciate it.
And thank
All right,
everybody
well,
for coming.
with that, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut. I'm seeing all the chat. They're saying very nice things.